Welcome to Glass in Session. I'm your host, Val. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the interview with Michael Juergens as much as I did. I find the wine project in Bhutan a fascinating subject, and Michael is such an engaging and fun wine personality and an effervescent human being who definitely believes in taking life by the horns. Giddy up. I don't know where he gets all his energy. But on to this week's topic, which is just a couple of countries to the north and to the west of Bhutan. Yes, we're still on our biggest continent, Asia, the home of almost 60% of the Earth's population. And that was according to population.net in early October. You can actually go online and see it change by the minute or by the birth, however you want to look at it. While the wines of Uzbekistan have been on my editorial calendar for some time, we will get to those, and Uzbekistan does make an appearance in today's topic. I really want to hang out in their neighboring country to the south, Afghanistan. I spent most of the summer immersed in some of William Dalrymple's books and Peter Frankopan's book about the Silk Roads, and in subjects centered around history in Afghanistan and the Koh-i-Noor diamond. That was a fascinating story, and civilization in this part of the world throughout the centuries. As with everything else, my ears would perk up whenever somebody would say wine or lush vineyards and Afghanistan in the same sentence. Lush vineyards in Afghanistan? Do tell me more, because I didn't know such a thing existed. Wine really was mentioned throughout Afghanistan's history in a mishmash of sources, also linked up in the show notes for you to check out. It was Babur, the Mughal ruler, who really brought the history to life for me. And because this dude was such a character, I had a sneaking suspicion you'd be interested in hearing some of his bizarre history. On the more serious side, after I'd poked around for just about everything I could find on this topic, I almost had second thoughts about recording this episode. The U.S. had just pulled out of Afghanistan, and I read about the disgusting things happening to women and girls all over again. And it seemed to me that talking about something as seemingly maybe flip, as the topic of wine in a place where human rights have pretty much been discarded seemed almost callous or careless. But in early September, the Taliban had gone into the Norwegian embassy to smash wine bottles and burn children's books, as one does. And after, many swear words, it kind of made me more determined to dig up whatever I could on alcohol's history in one of the 12 countries in the world where its own citizens are prohibited from drinking and can actually be punished for doing so, among other things. And the more I read, the more I thought, why not learn more about a place with, at best, an uncertain future, and at worst, it seems to be, from the outside, a backward-ass journey shoved down the throats of its terrorized people. I think we should learn more. We cannot erase history, and there is so much more to Afghanistan's history and their people than what we outsiders hear in the news and read in the newspapers. And every time I read a piece of history that mentions Afghanistan's orchards or lush vineyards or gardens or conservation efforts, I get sucked back in. So yes, at the last minute, I decided I will do this episode, and yay, my neighbor's dog stopped barking long enough for me to do so. And here's what I will not be talking about today: politics, religion, full stop. No, thank you. It's not what I do. Here's what I will be talking about today: grapes and wine. Maybe we'll throw in some drunken Mughals, some wine horns, more grapes, vines, more grapes, and it's going to go like this. First, some ancient history that for once doesn't start with the Romans and the Greeks and the monks and the blah, blah, blah. We'll visit the days of Babur, the Mughals, wine's role in all of it. And believe it or not, there was actually once a wine and spirits industry in Afghanistan. Archaeology does not lie. Then I'm going to tell you about the very prominent and valuable grape cultivation culture and its importance to the families, the villages, and economy of this country. Of course, we're going to talk a little bit about the varieties and species, because I can't help myself. And then I'm going to bring it all on forward and talk about more recent efforts to preserve the approximately, are you listening, 150,000 acres of vineyards that currently exist in Afghanistan, at least at last estimate. Are you ready for some history? I am. And today I'm pairing this with a Côte du Rhône on principle, because it's lunchtime and it's what's open. Like many other countries, alcohol production in Afghanistan dates back to the 4th century BC, if not farther back. Vineyards have existed in Afghanistan for millennia. And we know that Babur, which I've already mentioned, he was the founder of a 3-century-long Mughal dynasty in the 1500s. He enjoyed him some alcohol in the region. Babur, aka Zahir al-Din Muhammad, was a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Timur. In contrast to his conquering and pillaging ancestry, Babur was a lover of all things agriculture. He sings the praises of orchards of all kinds of fruits in his autobiography, where he calls the grapes sahibi, and he was especially known for having a melon fetish. Speaking of melons, sure, every once in a while he'd build towers with his defeated enemies' skulls, but the dude was cultured outside of that. Gastro Obscura lays it out there. He was a straight-up food snob. While he wrote a lot about Samarkand and Uzbekistan, his beloved homeland, he did make mention of the strong wine from Bukhara, west of Samarkand, and we'll get to all that in the Uzbekistan episode, because he really wasn't much of a drinker in his Samarkand days. But here's where we get to Afghanistan. Babur was eventually driven out of Samarkand, and he moved on to seize Kabul in 1504, and I believe he seized Kandahar sometime after that, and then eventually landed in India, where he would ascend to power in Delhi in 1526. And fun fact, his great-grandson built the Taj Mahal. But it was during those years in Kabul, he was known to have built at least 10 gardens, many of which grew fruit, and it was here that the historians believed he developed his taste for wine. What kind of wine? This is the mystery that I did set out to solve, which led me to this tentacled story. We did learn that during a visit to Herat in Afghanistan, he is quoted as saying, "Not committing the sin of wine drinking or knowing the cheering sensation of comfortable drunkenness," excuse me, little sip. During this trip to Herat, I think what I'm seeing in the history here is that his cousins were kind of pushing him to get his drunk on a little bit. And then his prime minister had to come in and have the cousins back off the peer pressure because he wasn't quite a drinker yet. But somewhere between 1504 and his move to India 2 decades later, this all changed. Something happened. The Economist, in a 2010 article, reports that there was an 11-year gap in Babur's obsessive diary keeping, or that period of time has been lost to the ages. They say that during this 11-year gap, I quote, "He took to the bottle with an enthusiasm that in the modern age would have seen him shipped off to rehab before one could say cheers," end quote. Now, it wasn't just alcohol that he enjoyed. He also munched on some majun. I thought that was a fun little tidbit. That's the Afghan equivalent of hash brownies. I don't know if I said it right. It was not in Forvo, but that was also in the 2010 Economist article. And then they go on to detail the party life, which included a lot of booze, multi-day binges, and a particular episode in which Babur was not only too drunk to remember riding home, this whole episode was memorialized in a painting by his grandson. And it's a funny drawing. If you can pull it up on Wiki, it's really cool to see. But to reset the focus, my point is not Babur whooping it up or his party life, but I was still kind of curious, again, what kind of wine was made with what kind of grapes was he drinking? You see why you couldn't watch a movie with me, by the way, that has wine in it. If there's a bottle, I have to see what they're drinking, show me the label, and then commentary will ensue. Anywho, when Babur moved on to India in the 1520s, we know he wasn't really happy. And not only did he just bitch about how much he hated it, he hated the weather. He bemoaned that there were, quote, "no good horses, no good dogs, not grapes, muskmelons or first-rate fruits, no ice or cold water, no good bread," and on and on. Turns out food snob Babur hated everything right down to the candlesticks. Yes, he said that. And I should mention now that India does make wine, and that could also be another episode. There are mentions of him binging bhang. It's like a weed booze, and alternating dry spells, which must have been before he gave up drinking for health reasons. And Babur had written to friends that he was craving wine parties, and he was yearning for the grapes and melons in Kabul. Babur did die at the age of 47 due to his failing health, so we're going to pick up the thread back in Afghanistan. Most of the vineyards in Afghanistan were around the Herat and Kabul area, as we learned in Babur's time, as well as Kandahar, and there were other areas up north, which I'm going to get to in a minute. I found this little nugget in Alex Dagan's 2019 book about his conservation efforts in Afghanistan and other war zones. Bagram, actually where I was for part of '04 and '05, is north of Kabul. It had once been a great winemaking center. It was a Buddhist stronghold at one point, which explains the prayer wheels that we found at the large market outside the main gate, which I talked about with Michael in the last episode. Another connection between Buddhist and even Islamist gatherings with respect to wine around the 13th century, so we're backing up a couple centuries, is evidenced by the wine horns found in the vicinity of Bagram. So this is how we know this about Bagram. I realize that modern day devout practices of Islam and Buddhism, they don't do alcohol, but I did attach some articles that do discuss the context and the historical connections between wine horns, alcohol, and these religions. But back to the wine horns. Okay, let's talk about those. A wine horn is really just a vessel in the shape of horn-adorned animals that were once used for blood sacrifices. Think goats and bulls and those kind of things. And this is per Akasoy Burnett Yoeli Tlalim in a book called Islam and Tibet, Interactions Along the Musk Routes. Again, who knew? I think I'm just going to go ask for a wine horn for my next birthday. Honey, I hope you're listening. In medieval Afghanistan, and referring to the Middle Ages now, not the Taliban-infested medievalness garbage that's going on right now, the wine industry of Afghanistan was considered to be at its golden age, if you will. And again, doesn't this make you wonder, during this golden age of wine, don't you want to know what kind of wine they were making? This went on, even exporting wines to that Mughal dynasty that Babur had taken to India until the late 1700s. So they were actually exporting wine at one time. What I'm really curious, though, to learn more about are the wines of Nuristan. Nuristan is located in the Hindu Kush area of northeastern Afghanistan, so it's very remote, very cut off, and it has a long history of winemaking, and it was one of the last holdouts against Islam domination. In a 2016 paper by Max Klimberg titled Trans-Regional Intoxication, Wine in Buddhist Gandhara and Kafiristan, it dives into the Hindu Kush's ancient wine cultures. Now, Kafiristan, you're like, Val, I thought you said Nuristan. This is what we know today as aforementioned Nuristan. In fact, Klimberg goes on to tell us that the area quite possibly may have been the original neighborhood, if you will, of Greek god Dionysus, which is Bacchus for you Romans. The area was originally called Kafiristan because kafir means non-believers, or so these people were labeled by the Muslims all around them who'd already been conquered by Islam. According to Klimberg's paper, the religious beliefs of the Kafirs were rooted in ancient shamanism and polytheistic practices, and there was some hedonism in there somewhere, I believe. I don't know if Klimberg says that, but I read other articles that do refer to that kind of let's just say serious wine parties. Their wine god was Indr, I-N-D-R, which is from Indian origins. Their deity is Indra. And then I guess this Indr oversaw the festivities that featured wine. In other words, citing Klimberg here, quote, socio-religious festive life in part enlivened by wine-based Dionysian features, unquote. Someone bring me my wine horn. No, I really don't know if they had wine horns here, but they have found silver cups in this area. Again, archaeology doesn't lie. And someone bring me my silver cup. Music, dancing, bacchanalian raves with Greek soldiers, and this is speculation. But this does bring me back to the wine. Klimberg does mention that the vines were pretty much only the vines that grew up the wild trees. They kind of trellised themselves and grew up the trees. And that really the only way to harvest was to climb the trees to pick the grapes. So they didn't make a lot of wine, but make wine they did. Because Babur, remember him? He made note of the strong yellowish wines of southern Kafiristan, and he was quoted as saying that the Kafirs drank more wine than water. Each had his own Khig, K-H-I-G, or personal goatskin wine bag. And I'm pretty sure here he's still talking about the Kafirs of Nuristan, not the Kalish Kafirs of Pakistan, which still exist today. Well, then bring me my goatskin wine bag, because when Charles Masson recorded his travels in the 1830s, in Afghanistan, he wrote of the Kafirs' love for singing and wine drinking out of the very fancy silver cups. And he said that the wine in the skins was pretty much hooch. Now, that's not his word. Hooch is my word. Or to quote, sour as to be undrinkable. Masson also mentions different types of wine. So there was almost, I'm not going to call it a crew system or anything, but a quality system. The better stuff was stored in these cisterns that were carved into the rock or stored in jars or whatever. So apparently, from what I gather in this article, the hooch was in the goat skins, but the good stuff was in the jars and the cisterns. Other reports would circulate in the late 1890s from the likes of Sir George Scott Robertson regarding other drinking vessels like tin, wood, and the wine being watered down. He does mention wine presses or other practices, but he does skimp a bit on the viticulture. Alas, in the winter of 1895 and 1896, the Kafir civilization was pretty much destroyed by Afghan army and mullahs, and their temples were torn down, and their land was renamed Nuristan, which translates to either enlightenment or land of light, because now they were under Muslim domination. You can read about these ventures because there are other explorers and findings in Klimberg's paper. And it does go on to talk about the Kalish Kafirs, which are carrying on with their apparently thriving wine and viticultural traditions. It's a really great paper. I like the pictures, but I still had to, kind of sort out a few things. So I'd rather you read that for yourself. In the early part of the 20th century, now moving on, under Kings Amanullah and Zahir Shah, who was the last king of Afghanistan, alcohol and cocktail parties were still part of the Kabul social scene, mostly for the elite, however. Fun fact, Zahir Shah was my husband's neighbor in Rome in the 1970s during his exile. Not my husband's exile, the king's exile. By the 1960s, the other regions in Europe and the U.S. were having their own wine revolutions, while viticulture at that time was being revitalized near Kabul. Afghanistan was looking once again to produce wine, but the Taliban eventually screwed this up too, and this is why we can't have nice things. In 1992, the Taliban outlawed wine production altogether by criminalizing trading, and the industry just never recovered. This is from a Wine Plus 23 June 2021 article. Also, according to Wine Plus, or maybe it's Vine Plus, there were 62,000 hectares of vines in around 2012. Wiki has it at about 60,000. This is 150,000 acres. 150,000 acres of vines in Afghanistan. It turns out Afghanistan has some great terroir and climate characteristics to produce quality wine, but still, I think putting together their wine industry has been very, very difficult, which is why I have this very fractured, tentacled story to tell you. And even though there is no longer a viable wine industry, according to the World Health Organization website, there's barely any alcohol consumption, or I should say at least reported among its residents. Visitors, tourists, and some of the military units were able to bring in alcohol. Like if you go there, go tour, you can bring in 2 bottles, or at least you could until, a couple months ago. But it was really the table grapes and the sultanas that have been popular in this general area of the world, and they still are today. So let's move on to the grape gab. So without any viable wine industry, it's mostly about the grapes and raisins now. Currently, get it? Current? I'll be here all night. Currently, grapes are grown all over Afghanistan. I've seen some of what they call the soyagi, or dried grapes, for sale online. You can buy little packages of dried Afghani grapes, but most are grown for families to consume or, as to sell in a farmer's market type thing. I found an article out of Poland in a Colloquium Journal of Agricultural Sciences in 2020 that says there are more than 100 varieties of grapes that, oddly enough, belong to Vitis vinifera. This is the very species of grape that is most often used for wine. There are 3 main varieties. There are the Shindokani, the Kishmishi white, and I've seen it spelled different ways, but think Sultana grape here. Both are white, and they're used for raisins as well. There's a grape called the Taifi. I think it's classified as a white grape, but the pictures, it looks slightly pink, thinking of like a Pinot Grigio type grape. And there's an Atlas Obscure article that describes the Taifi as a thicker skinned grape. So we do know that. And that makes it really good for drying and preserving. So when these grapes are harvested for the families, many of them are preserved for winter in these mud and straw containers called kanjinas. And of course, I linked up the article, and there is a video in there where they show how these things are made, and they show cracking open the kanjina after a couple months, because these grapes are meant to last throughout the winter. There are other grape varieties. I'm not going to read the whole list of them. I couldn't forego any of them for you, but there's the Husseini, the Ascari, the Goladan, Spenmanga, Bedana, and the Kishmishi Sia, which is a black seedless. And also new commercial varieties were being introduced, at least as of last year. Thompson Seedless, Red Globe, Ruby, we've heard of those, crimson seedless, black emerald, things like that. Hey, Val, that's a lot of grapes. Yes, there's over 100. And now I'm going to list each one for you in alphabetical order. No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to do that. But let's talk about some of the preservation efforts that have happened over there in the last decade. I found an article on Mike Vezith. It's always a great place to look for a wine article. He's the wine economist. And in his 2012 article, he does state that although Afghanistan is not an important wine producing country, he talks about how they, just as in Iran, are a major crop. And he wrote about Washington State's viticulture and enology program that was, back in 2012, of course, working to help troops understand basics about vine biology, viticulture, water issues, threats, and the cultural significance and specifics of grape production to the Afghan culture. And I found this really interesting. I'd never heard anything about this. And quoting Washington State University in his article, nearly half of the fruit-bearing land in Afghanistan is dedicated to grapes. As for these grapes, like I said, they are table grapes, sultanas, raisins, but it is the largest fruit crop for the country. At the time, the program was being run by Dr. Michelle Moyer of the Viticulture and Enology Extension Program at Washington State. I had her page up for a while and I thought I would email her or call her and see if she would, kind of fill me in on what's happened to the program in the last 9 years or so. But I thought, well, she's probably got better things to do. It's harvest season than talk to a podcaster about a program from 9 years ago. But what this program did was fascinating. It was an effort to help the farmers and try to minimize damage from war efforts on the ground in these grape communities. And the program itself was actually called the Grape Community of Practice, or the GCOP. This extension network brought together 87 viticultural professionals from 31 states here in the U.S., plus Ontario, Canada, which also has a fine wine industry. And the program's focus was mainly on agriculture and agribusiness, which includes education about how grape growing is different in this part of the world than the perfectly trellis lines of corduroy we're used to seeing in the U.S. and other, manicured wine vineyards. In the 2012 article on University of Wisconsin-Madison's website, they detailed that just like in some historic grape growing areas in Europe, one might see vines climbing up the trees, as I mentioned, or other structures. They have these giant concrete pillars in some of the pictures with the vines crawling up them. Again, in the show notes, some of these articles do have some fascinating photography in them. One might also encounter head-trained or bush-trained vines. Now, we've all seen those in the warmer regions of southern France, hello, Banyuls, or southern Rhone. You'll see them in Sicily, South Africa. I've seen them in Amador County, if we're talking about the old gnarled Zinfandel vines. And remember, I mentioned the dried grapes. You might recall the drying houses I talked about in the Pasito wine episode in 2020, and they have these drying houses here. They're called kishmishkhanas, and they're usually quite big, but these drying structures are unfortunately possible insurgent hangouts. So just like our stomachs turned in reading about the vineyards destroyed in Europe during World Wars I and II, and can you imagine having your produce harvest destroyed in this day and age because of counterinsurgency battles? I guess that's why this story grabbed me. There were units from Wisconsin, Washington, Mississippi National Guard, other military units that reached out for this type of education before they sent their troops over to Afghanistan. And some of these units actually would bring back photos and descriptions of the raisin production for the GCOP team to use in their awareness program. But it's not just about not pissing off the farmers in the communities that do depend on these grapes for food and livelihood. The Army also has to think about, in addition to the soldiers' safety, which is paramount, we have to compensate for damaged vines or loss of income because of a battle. We have to pay them for that. One cool fact that was delivered to the troops during these briefings that really kind of brought the message home was that these drying houses, or these khanas, some of them can hold up to 6 metric tons of raisins. That's at the time about 13,000 US dollars. So that's a lot of money to a farmer over there. So you add this to the fact that the vines are still, despite their climate and their terroir, they still are susceptible to fungal diseases, as every vineyard has their problem. So if these vines are destroyed, or the irrigation ditches are trashed or contaminated, the vines may not recover. And so we leave what's left of these vineyards. I couldn't resist reading the comments, which is something I stopped doing on social media a long time ago. Don't ever do that. On The Wine Economist, however, safe place to read comments and quite interesting. My favorite was from Benjamin in 2015, and I hope he doesn't mind me reading this. It's a really cool comment that says, enjoyed reading this article. It was actually during my last combat deployment to Afghanistan that I tripped over a vine while on patrol in the middle of the night, and I decided to become a sommelier once my service was complete. With programs like this, maybe someday I'll return to that country on better terms. What a valiant wish, Benjamin. I will certainly raise a glass to that. Now, I don't know if Benjamin ever got into the wine industry, but I do get emails every once in a while from veterans asking how they can do just that. So I would love to know if you got into it. I also don't know how long the GCOP lasted or how big of an impact it really had or what kind of data is available if we were able to save the vineyards. But as you can see, I keep saying tentacles because the story had so many different places to go. I never was able to answer my burning wine question. What kind of wine did they make? What kind of grapes did they use? And does it really matter? I know I might have missed a lot of things here. There's still a lot of resources, due to time and due to resource constraints, hashtag ICANN has PDF, to keep you from throwing your phone. That was also one of my missions here. So I realize, fair listener, there is much we may never know, but I think we can all agree and appreciate learning something new and substantial about Afghanistan beyond history and Babur's wine parties and melon fetishes and all that. It's the love of the grape that brought us to this place. And I certainly enjoyed learning about the humble vine's importance yet again to an entire country. On that note, if you've made it this far and you have not yet thrown your phone, I really do want to thank you for honoring me with a place in your podcast feed and in your ears this week. I know this is the most unconventional podcast, and that's what I set out to do. So I thank you for staying with me. I thank you for your comments. And you can always reach out to me between sessions. So feel free, find me at Twitter at WineGalUnboxed. You can email me at val@glassinsession.com. On the Facebook, Pinterest, and Insta Spaces, I'm Vino with Val. Glass in Session is a production and registered trademark of Vino with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joy Stock. Website is glassinsession.com/podcast.